Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Science fiction is by far my favorite genre. I started reading science fiction way back when I was 8 years old. I started with the classics. 2001, A Space Odyssey. Far better than that hipster film. Fahrenheit 451 and 1984 are just to name a few. Finding good science fiction is sadly not an easy prospect, with many hack writers turning in utter drivel. It would be in the year 2007 that I would discover an interesting subset of science fiction, the Baen book. Baen is a publishing company that primarily publishes science fiction and fantasy that is on a different side of the political spectrum than the norm. Back in the day, I referred to it as Republican science fiction, and I was quite pleased by my discovery. The novels are generally pro-military and pro-civic ethics. The United States is not seen as some great evil, and instead is seen as a powerful force for good. Amongst the more counterculture sci-fi fans, John Ringo's name stands supreme. For me, his last few novels have been boring and, shall I say, preachy. And he also shows a lack of morality in many instances as well, but that need not detain us at this time, for the novel we are reviewing today is from 2007, the time when John Ringo really got into his stride as a writer. This novel and John Ringo's works were my first forays into Republican science fiction. The characters were from regions where I was from. The military was competent and the individual was championed versus the mass. This novel was released in 2007 and my grandfather picked it up that same year. At a local Walmart of all places. Sadly, he hated it. He stated that it got too technical, which is indeed a staple of most Baen books. In a Baen book, get ready for info dumps on everything from military weaponry to quantum physics. He gave it to me to try, and to say the least, I was hooked. The novel opens up after a massive explosion at the University of Central Florida. Right here we can see this is going to be different from the norm. Most SF books never leave California or MIT. In a Baen book, things seldom travel above the Mason-Dixon line. This explosion is investigated by a military officer named Crichton, which of course is a reference to Michael Crichton, the famous science fiction writer. He, using real science, and trust me, the novel goes into full detail, determines that the explosion was non-nuclear. He investigates further only to find a weird visual anomaly, and out of the visual anomaly drops a foul Xenos! If, like me, you wanted a real book that feels realistic, after you really read the first chapter, you are going to be hooked. And it only gets better from here. So, science time. The UOF was trying to make a Higgs boson particle, and sadly they broke the science, and thus portals to another world are popping up all over the US and around the world. This is somewhat reminiscent to the novel Footprints of Thunder by James F. David. In that novel, well, the time broke and thus portals to the past opened up around the world, and thus the government and individuals had to cope. Here we have much the same thing, only way less soft. The main character for the novel is science hero William Weaver. He is an example of yet another Baen element. He is not your typical science hero. He is, of course, a Republican, and he is, of course, from the southern U.S., and not LA or MIT or Washington, D.C., or anything like that. Reading that as a teenager was quite eye-opening indeed. Finally, a novel that gave people from the South the credit they were due. Remember, in the media, the southern U.S. is seen as backwards and filled with only trailer trash, when in reality that couldn't be further from the truth, and Baen books and their writers know this. William Weaver is on the surface not that original. We have had numerous science heroes before. Hell, I had even read novels with a number of them before as well, prior to reading Into the Looking Glass. I had read a novel called Temple, an excellent action novel by Matthew Riley. In that novel, we had a science hero named William, a lot of Bills, Race, who was more or less Indiana Jones for the 21st century, but he was still part of the Indiana Jones archetype. What sets Weaver apart is threefold. 1, he is a physicist. 2, he is not a flabby bastard at the beginning, and he literally says in the course of the novel that he gets his best idea from climbing the side of a mountain than sitting in a lab. And 3, he's not a wuss. He doesn't hate guns or the military, and he is quick to advocate using nukes against the foul Xenos. All told, he is a grade A epic character, and he is one of the great science heroes. Just imagine Albert Einstein with a six-pack and an AR slung over one shoulder. He is brought in to study the portals, later termed looking glasses, and we are then introduced to a kid that survived the blast due to a foul Xenos named Tuffy, a sapient Xeno that can talk to her telepathically. This character is built up quite a bit, but never really goes anywhere later in the series. Eventually, it's time for the fightin'. As this is indeed a Bane book, we need science, and we need shootin', and some evil Xenos attack. And as a Bane book, the civilians in the novel have guns and use them. The foul Xenos in the novel are called the Titcher, later renamed the Dreen for ease of pronunciation. They send a scouting party and attack an old couple's house. They, being in the south, and in a Bane book, fight back with a 12-gauge shotgun. They take out one Xeno, but that is not enough to stem the tide. The next day, Weaver and his sidekick for the novel, Command Master Chief Miller, investigate alongside some Army National Guardsmen. Because remember, hard SF. They find the portal, and they get attacked by hordes of foul Xenogens. There are two basic types of evil alien. You got a basic quadruped alien that uses melee, and a long-range alien that shoots biological thorns that can pierce armor. They attack in heavy numbers, and even Weaver has to get in on some of the shooting. He is initially confused about how guns work, which always surprised me. Guns are simple mechanical objects that are quite easy to figure out. In short, if you can use a PC or your phone, you can use a gun. But characters and people in general always seem to have difficulty figuring out such simple objects. In any event, Weaver does some shooting and almost gets killed, but is saved by a local SWAT team. Then we get some awesomeness. The novel is currently taking place in the southern US, and in the southern US we have many things. Guns chief among them. Gotta love Bane books. The people of the town where the portal opened up gather into a militia and drive back the foul Xenos hordes. To say that I was floored when that happened would be an understatement. Here we have a sci-fi book that has civilians coming together and forming a militia and providing their own defense. At that point, I had never read or thought I would ever read something of this greatness. Remember, sci-fi is generally, shall we say, on the opposite end of the spectrum where guns are bad and citizens, especially southern citizens, are useless. Here we have citizens of the southern US coming together and providing for their common defense. And one of them even brings a 50 T-Rex rifle. Yes, that was real, but sadly, as of 2018, it's a bit of a defunct cartridge. The citizens of the US provide for their common defense and push the Xenos back, and the military rushes some further reinforcements to them. Another Bane staple is mocking the media, and the media is mocked throughout the novel. And there's even a passage where the novel mocks the media calling the militia attack the charge of the Redneck Brigade, which is something that would indeed be said in this world indeed. After this initial attack, we are treated to various descriptions of other less savory things coming out of the portals, and Boca Raton gets taken out by some sort of Cthulhu monster that's never really followed up upon again. We then get introduced to cat aliens called the Marie. Spoiler alert, they are just a proverbial red herring for the old Titcherdreen. Speaking of that particular alien species, the Dreen began attacking all throughout the US, and eventually the US cannot stem the tide without nuking them. They do so, and then we get to one of the more weird parts of the novel. Weaver and Miller and a team of Navy SEALs suit up in power armor! So wait, you're telling me you got a novel with portals, militiamen fighting Xenos, and power armor? It's as awesome as it sounds, and the writer actually calls the power armor mechas. Weaver and the team use the power armor to try and break through a Dreen portal in order to secure some intelligence about the enemy. They are able to break through the portal, but then they actually set off a quark bomb. In short, they break through, they see the Dreen side, which is more or less a biological cavern of a sort, as the Dreen are more or less store-brand Zerg complete with creep. And in the cavern, they start to get overwhelmed, they fall back, and just before Weaver goes through the portal, he shoots a giant spider alien and thus sets off a quark explosion. What's a quark, other than a Ferengi bartender? Well, it's a science particle that does the science. Just read the book, and then scratch your head in confusion. The quark bomb goes off, and Weaver goes somewhere and sees that Tuffy alien from the first bit of the book. And this part is a bit confusing, and you guessed it, goes nowhere. Eventually, Weaver is spat out, and they are back to square one. Now, I am spoiling the novel's ending because it is a series, and if everyone died at the end, there wouldn't have been 3 goddamn sequels. Humanity gets a break when a portal opens to a world inhabited by 11-foot-tall, 3-eyed friendly Xenos called the Adar, that are 100 years ahead of humanity. They show them how to turn off the portals, and thus stop the fell Xenos invasion, and they give them a quark bomb the size of a standard nuke to do it. Now my problem is that they have to get it through heavily fortified enemy lines. The final battle is an epic one, to say the least, and in Bane fashion even brings up logistics. Weaver remarks that he knows it's a do-or-die battle because the military forces did not bring up any food service trucks or field kitchens. My inner military history nerd squeed at that as well. As you would expect, humanity prevails and the Dreen are defeated, and the novel ends on a high note as the 3-eyed guys give humanity a random black box that in and of itself is a reference to black box tech, aka tech that no one knows how to work. Weaver, being awesome, determines that it is a space drive, and even this caused me to almost faint from joy. He references Star Trek by name, which I didn't think you could even do, and compares the black box to the Romulan singularity drive from Star Trek TNG. I had never read anything like that before. All the writers I read up to that point never even acknowledged popular culture at all. And here we have a character that not only knows that Star Trek exists, but even references a great episode of it. It's almost like Ringo was one of us. One of us. The novel ends with plans being drawn up to convert an Ohio-class sub into a spacecraft, thus giving humanity the stars. And thus the novel draws to a close. The end. What a novel it was. To say that Into the Looking Glass floored me is a considerable understatement. I had never read anything like that before, and in many instances since. It had every element I had ever wanted to read, but never thought I would. The characters are excellent, the science a little confusing, and the world amazing. The novel would receive 3 sequels: Vorpal Blade, Maxome Foe, and last but not least, Claws That Catch. Each sequel would sadly be lower in quality than the last, and would get more information dense, and would begin lacking in character. What made this novel so great was the fact that the characters were relatable and the world felt real. The sequels became rather dry and somewhat boring military SF. They are still good novels, but lack the overall punch of Into the Looking Glass, and a lot of concepts would be dropped going forward, and even Weaver himself would be made a side character. And Claws That Catch even jokes about this. His replacement was less than, shall we say, stellar. A science stew named Two-Gun Berg. Two-Gun Berg is the worst kind of science stew. He is, of course, a spec marine, and is super smart, dead sexy, and even uses 2 cut-down Barrett 50 caliber rifles as pistols when wearing his power armor, and even marries his small-town sweetheart. It's boring and shallow and generic as all hell compared to the other characters. In the end, I highly recommend Into the Looking Glass, and while the rest of the series is of lower quality, I'd still recommend reading them because they are still entertaining in their own right, even if they are a bit flawed compared to the very first novel. And so, I am General Lotz, wishing you good Starship Troopers, and good armor, or whatever makes you happy. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon so that I can continue bringing you this awesome content.